I'd been hiking the ridgeline all afternoon, the rain soaking through my jacket and boots, turning the trail into a slippery, muddy mess. Every step felt like a small battle against the earth, the slick roots and loose stones eager to send me tumbling down the slope. I had set out early that morning, thinking a solo hike through the backcountry would be a welcome escape. But by the time I reached the hollow, the sun was gone, swallowed by thick, low-hanging clouds. The forest around me had become a wet, dark silence, the kind that presses on your chest and makes the air feel heavy and unbreathable. I stopped for a moment, leaning on my trekking poles, and felt the chill creep in through my soaked clothing. My teeth chattered, and I realized that if I didn't get some kind of shelter soon, the night would be unbearable. I set up my small tarp as best I could on the uneven forest floor, struggling to find level ground amid the mud and tangled roots. The mist clung to everything, weaving in and out of the trees, curling around their trunks like long, thin fingers. It moved in a way that didn't feel natural, like it had a rhythm of its own, and I could have sworn it lingered longer in some spots than others, as if it were aware of me. I shook my head and muttered to myself, trying to laugh off the feeling, but the forest was too quiet for comfort. No birds, no rustling of small animals, just the patter of rain and the occasional snap of a branch somewhere in the distance. Each sound, however faint, sent a jolt through me. I had barely finished arranging my tarp when I heard it. The soft, dragging footstep. It didn't sound like mine, and it came from somewhere beyond the small clearing I'd chosen for my camp. My heart skipped and I froze listening. I called out, my voice breaking against the thick mist. "Hello? Is someone there?" My words vanished instantly, swallowed by the forest, leaving nothing but echoing silence. Another step, this one slower, deliberate. I could feel it more than hear it, a pressure in the air, like someone was standing just beyond the line of visibility, watching, waiting. I tried to convince myself it was another hiker, maybe lost or equally seeking shelter from the rain. But no response came. I didn't hear a voice calling back. No cough, no rustle of clothing, nothing. I tried to look around, flashlight sweeping through the mist, but the beam barely penetrated the fog. Every tree looked the same, twisted and slick with rain. The footsteps sounded again, closer this time, brushing against leaves and wet branches. Yet when I spun around, the clearing was empty. I wanted to leave, to pack up and head back to the ridge trail. But the mud made movement slow, and my anxiety made it feel impossible to do anything quietly. Night fell fully then, and with it came a damp, almost tangible fear. I huddled under my tarp, hugging my knees, trying to make myself smaller, hoping to become invisible. The rain continued, steady and unrelenting, and the mist grew heavier, filling the spaces between the trees until I could barely make out the trunks a few feet away. And then came the whispers. At first I thought it was the wind, the sound of it curling through branches and leaves. But soon I realized they weren't wind. They were soft, indistinct murmurs, words that almost formed a sentence but never quite did. I strained to understand, but every time I tried to focus, it seemed to drift just out of comprehension, teasing me with meaning that would not settle. Hours passed like this, each second stretching into eternity. Every snap of a branch, every droplet of rain hitting the tarp made my heart jump. I tried to keep my mind busy, running through the trail map, counting steps in my head, anything to distract from the feeling that I wasn't alone. Sometimes I would hear the dragging footstep again, always just beyond the clearing, always stopping when I dared to look. I stopped calling out after a while, afraid that speaking might draw attention. Sleep was impossible. The fear made my muscles tense, my teeth grinding, every instinct screaming to get up and run, but I dared not move. Sometime in the early hours, I thought I heard breathing. It was soft, uneven, not my own. My stomach lurched and I nearly screamed, but the sound was gone as soon as I recognized it. The forest was holding its breath as if it were waiting for me to act. I tried to focus on anything rational, a lost hiker, an animal, a trick of the wind and rain. But my mind kept returning to the sound of the footsteps, the whispers, the way the mist twisted around the trees like a living thing. By dawn, I was exhausted, shaking, and drenched. The mist had begun to thin, lifting just enough to give me some clarity. That's when I saw them. Footprints, human-shaped and unmistakable, surrounding my tarp. They circled the camp, close enough that I could see the impressions of mud in each sole. But I had been alone when I set up. I had counted every step, every movement, every placement of my gear. These footprints were not mine. Some were small, some large, some uneven, as though whoever or whatever had made them had walked carefully around the edges of my camp. I couldn't tell which direction they had come from or where they had gone. I packed my tarp as quickly as I could, my hands trembling so badly that I dropped the stakes several times. I tried to leave without looking back, but the forest seemed to stretch endlessly, the trail no longer recognizable. The fog lingered in pockets, clinging to roots and rocks like a damp curtain, and I felt eyes on me from every direction, though I couldn't see anyone. My boots slipped in the mud, my breath came in ragged gasps, and I swore I could hear soft footsteps behind me, always matching my pace, stopping when I stopped, resuming when I moved. It took hours to finally reach the ridge trail. The mist had mostly lifted by then, revealing familiar landmarks, but the unease remained. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see a figure among the trees. Nothing appeared, yet the sense of being followed didn't dissipate. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, stress and exhaustion amplifying every sound, every shadow. Yet even now, weeks later, I can't think of that hollow without my stomach tightening, my skin crawling. I never saw anyone, never found any explanation. Yet the footprints, the dragging step, the whispers, they were real. Sometimes I dream of the hollow, the way the mist seemed to reach out for me, the way the forest paused and watched. I wake in the night, certain I hear dragging footsteps outside my window. I can't explain what happened, and no one I've told believes me, but I know what I felt, what I heard, what I saw. The hollow has a memory, I think, and it keeps those who wander too far alone, teaching you, in the quietest and darkest ways, that some places are not meant to be visited. The rain, the mist, the dragging footstep, every element lingers in my mind, sharper than any nightmare. I can walk by that ridge now, but I avoid the hollow, the place that pressed on my chest, that made the mist feel alive. And sometimes, in the deepest part of the night, I can swear I still hear it, just beyond the edges of my hearing, waiting for me to return. The rain had begun in the late afternoon, turning the creek into a thin, murky ribbon that snaked through the forest. I followed it, hoping the bend would lead me back to the main trail, but the further I walked, the more unfamiliar everything became. The water churned quietly over rocks and roots, a low, steady roar that filled the hollow, competing with the soft patter of rain on leaves. The forest was still, the kind of still where every sound you make seems louder than it should be. I thought I was alone. And at first, that solitude was comforting, like the world had shrunk down to just me and the creek. The shadows between the trees seemed to deepen with every step. At one point I thought I saw movement, a flash of something crouched behind a mossy boulder near the water's edge. I froze, flashlight trembling in my hand, heart hammering against my ribs. I called out, my voice uneven, and the beam of my light swung toward the shape. But the boulder was empty. The forest seemed to swallow any trace of it, as if it had never been there at all. I laughed nervously to myself, muttering about tricks of the fog and rain. But the uneasy weight in my chest didn't lift. I kept walking, boots sinking into soft mud, water trickling into the toes of my soaked shoes. The rain had slowed now, almost a drizzle, and the night pressed in around me. That's when I heard it. My name whispered softly through the trees. I froze, scanning the shadows, flashlight slicing through mist and leaves, but saw nothing. My breath came in sharp, uneven gasps, and I shook my head. It's just the wind, I told myself, though the sound of my name had been clear, deliberate. Not a trick of the echoing creek, not a stray branch in the rain. Someone or something had spoken it. Panic began to settle in. I wanted to turn back, retrace my steps, but the forest had changed. The creek's bends now twisted in ways I didn't remember. Roots snagged my boots, rocks slick with rain. Every time I tried to look behind me, the shadows seemed to stretch farther than they should. And always, somewhere just out of sight, there was movement. I could catch glimpses of it. A shadow flitting between trees, the reflection of wet eyes in the water. But every time I focused, it vanished. The forest felt alive, pressing in on me, breathing in the same rhythm as I did. I whispered my own name, hoping to prove I was sane. But the response was immediate, a repetition, soft, distorted, drifting through the trees. I stumbled, tripping over a root, and when I looked up, The creek's path seemed to have shifted. The bend I had been following was gone, replaced with unfamiliar rocks and undergrowth. Panic surged. I realized I didn't know which way led back. Every direction seemed equally endless, equally ominous. I pressed forward along the water, trying to keep the creek in sight, but the whispers came again, this time more distinct. Words I couldn't understand, syllables stretched and twisted, some rising and falling like a lullaby, others harsh and jarring. My flashlight flickered violently, and in that brief darkness I thought I saw faces, shadowed, fleeting, pale against the rain-soaked trees. I spun around, but the shapes were gone. I cursed under my breath, trying to steady my pulse. Logic told me it was just exhaustion, fear, and rain playing tricks. But instinct screamed otherwise. I was not alone. Hours passed in a blur. I stumbled through wet undergrowth, slipping repeatedly, my clothes soaked through, muscles aching from constant tension. Every time I slowed, I heard it. Footsteps crunching over leaves, soft but deliberate, always keeping pace with me. I turned sharply, swinging the flashlight, but the trees revealed nothing. Sometimes I would hear a whisper of laughter, soft and fleeting, like a sound caught just beyond understanding. The creek guided me onward, and yet I knew, deep in my gut, that it wasn't taking me where I wanted to go. Eventually, I came to a small clearing where the creek widened, forming a shallow pool. The water rippled unnaturally, reflecting a distorted version of the trees above. My reflection in the water was jagged, ghostly, and for a moment I thought I saw another figure standing behind me, mirroring my movements exactly. I spun around. Nothing. My pulse thudded painfully in my ears. I wanted to scream, wanted to run, but my legs shook uncontrollably. Every instinct screamed for me to leave, yet I couldn't tell which way was out. The whispers continued, floating on the wet air, now joined by faint dripping sounds, footsteps in rhythm with my own. I decided to follow the creek downstream, hoping it would lead to the main trail or some sign of civilization. The forest grew darker, older, more oppressive. Trees leaned closer, their wet branches reaching out like arms. I thought I heard my name again, not in a whisper this time, but clear and insistent, almost right behind me. I spun, flashlight cutting through the night, catching only the shifting mist and the curve of the creek. My legs moved faster, but the path seemed endless, bending in impossible ways, looping back on itself. At some point I stumbled onto a fallen log and fell hard, mud coating my hands and knees. The creek bubbled and gurgled beside me, and for a terrifying instant I thought I saw hands reaching up from the water, pale and wet, disappearing as I blinked. My heart pounded, adrenaline surging, and I scrambled to my feet. I couldn't stay still, couldn't allow myself to think. Every second I paused, every breath I took seemed to bring the forest closer, more suffocating. Hours, or maybe minutes, later, I finally broke through the trees and onto a small, familiar path. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the forest seemed quieter, almost unnaturally so. I stopped to catch my breath, shivering, soaked, and listened. Nothing. The creek, which had been a roaring companion through my fear, now trickled quietly, almost apologetically, as though it had never guided me into that nightmare. I glanced back into the trees, but the mist was gone, leaving only the slick darkness of wet trunks and leaf-strewn ground. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in those woods, that the whispers, the shadows, and the creek itself were aware of me in a way no rational mind could explain. The forest had followed me, guided me, and toyed with me. It wasn't just a trail. It was a living, patient thing, waiting for anyone foolish enough to wander its bends alone. I never returned to that hollowed stretch of creek, and I avoid the forest in heavy rain now. But the memory lingers. The way the whispers seemed to curl around my mind. The way the mist clung to everything. The sensation that eyes were everywhere. I can't explain it, and maybe I never will. But I know what I felt, and I know the creek still waits for those who wander too far alone. Even tonight, when I close my eyes, I can hear it, a soft, relentless gurgle, accompanied by the faintest echo of my name, carried on the wet wind. And every time it comes, I remember how utterly small and alone I was in that forest. How a single creek could seem like a river of dread, carrying me deeper into a place that didn't want me to leave. The last mile of my hike was the worst. Rain poured from heavy dark clouds, drenching my jacket and running down my face in cold streams. The ridge's trail was slick with mud, roots slick as glass underfoot, and every step required careful attention. The wind whipped through the trees, bending the hemlocks and making them groan like old timbers, and the forest seemed to close in around me. The fog had started creeping along the ground hours earlier, curling around tree trunks and hiding the trail ahead in a thick, wet blanket. Each breath I took was heavy and damp, mingling with the smell of wet earth and pine. I kept moving, boots squelching in the mud, but a gnawing unease had settled in my chest, a feeling that I wasn't alone. At first, I tried to convince myself it was my imagination. Shadows from the trees shifted strangely in the rain, and every fallen branch or rustle of leaves played tricks on my eyes. But then I saw it, movement just off the trail. A shape flitted between the hemlocks, always just beyond my peripheral vision, never fully visible. My heart jumped and I froze, thinking it might be another hiker or maybe some animal. I called out, but only my voice echoed back, swallowed by the rain and wind. My flashlight beam cut through the mist, illuminating nothing but dripping branches and the slick trail. Yet the sense of eyes watching me remained, impossible to shake. I quickened my pace, trying to put some distance between myself and whatever it was. But the shadows moved too. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, a dark figure seemed to linger in the corner of my vision, flitting along the ridge in ways that didn't seem natural. My mind insisted I was seeing things, that the combination of rain, mud, and exhaustion was making me paranoid. But the whispers came next, the soft crunch of boots in the wet leaves behind me. At first I thought it must be another hiker following the same trail. I spun around, flashlight slicing through the fog, but there was nothing there. Not a soul, not a glimmer of movement, only the endless wet forest. I tried to reason with myself, telling myself the sound was my own boots displacing leaves, that my exhaustion had conjured phantom steps. But my pulse didn't settle, and every snap of a twig, every shift in the wind seemed amplified, deliberate. I could feel the presence behind me, patient and quiet, keeping pace without making a direct appearance. Every instinct screamed to turn and run, but the ridge was narrow, steep on either side, and the mud made footing precarious. I moved faster, heart hammering, eyes darting between trees and trail, but the shadows kept pace. Time became a blur. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, rain hammering my hood and seeping into my boots. I tried talking aloud, calling out to whoever, or whatever, might be there. But no answer came, only the echo of my own voice mingling with the groan of wind through the pines. My breathing became uneven, ragged, my muscles screaming from exertion and tension. Every turn of the trail revealed nothing, yet I could feel the weight of observation, pressing from just beyond the trees. The shadows seemed to fold in and out of reality, never fully graspable, just enough to keep my mind on edge. At one point, I stumbled over a root, sprawling into the wet mud. My flashlight skidded, illuminating the slope beside me, and I swear I saw a figure crouched there, watching. It was pale, nearly blending with the mist, and frozen in place. I scrambled back to my feet, heart hammering, but when I swung the light again, nothing was there. The mud beneath me seemed to sigh as I regained footing, a soft squelching sound echoing through the fog. The figure, or whatever it was, had vanished, leaving only the sound of distant rain and the wet trail beneath my boots. I tried to calm myself, slowed my breathing, and listened. The crunching came again, faint at first, then closer. Someone, or something, was walking behind me, step for step, yet no shadow appeared in the beam of my light. My mind raced. Could it be another hiker trapped in the fog? But I had been on this trail alone all day, and the trail was rarely used. The thought of someone following me, unseen and silent, made the skin on the back of my neck prickle. I wanted to stop, to turn and confront it, but the fear anchored me in place. I started moving again, faster now, boots skidding on slick mud, flashlight beam trembling with my hands. The ridge narrowed, roots and rocks forcing careful navigation, but the feeling of being stalked intensified. The shadows seemed to cling to me, flitting just out of focus, always present but never fully revealed. I tried calling for help, screaming, but the sound seemed swallowed by the fog. Each shout made the crunching steps behind me grow louder, closer, and I realized that running might draw attention instead of alleviating it. My pulse thumped, every nerve on fire, and still the ridge stretched on endlessly, the trail disappearing into fog and dark trees. Hours, or maybe only minutes, passed in a disorienting haze. Rain blurred the edges of the forest, and the fog turned the world into a gray, wet void. I stumbled again, catching my boot on a rock and nearly tumbling down the slope. My flashlight fell to the mud, beam flickering, and I thought I saw eyes reflected in the wet earth for a split second. I scrambled to retrieve it, heart in my throat, but when the light stabilized, nothing was there. Just the trail, slick and treacherous, and the relentless feeling that I was being followed. Eventually, the trail widened slightly, the ridge leveling out, and I dared to glance behind me. The fog had thinned a little, but still I saw nothing. Yet the sensation of eyes, of presence, refused to leave. I slowed, trying to rationalize. The shadows, the crunching, the figures in the fog, they could all be exhaustion, stress, the mind playing cruel tricks in isolation. And yet the instinctual terror in my chest told me otherwise. Every fiber of my being screamed that I had been observed, hunted in the quietest way possible, and that leaving the ridge would not end it. I made it to a small outcropping where the trail leveled, mud giving way to stone slick with rain. I paused to catch my breath, and in the stillness the crunching returned, not directly behind me, but circling, as though whatever was there was pacing, waiting. I spun slowly, flashlight scanning the trees, and saw nothing, but the weight of that presence pressed down on me. I could almost feel the wet hemlocks bending toward me, the forest itself leaning in. The ridge, which had seemed like a path of freedom and solitude earlier, now felt like a corridor of observation, a trap masked by rain and fog. Eventually, the rain lessened, and the fog lifted slightly, revealing distant peaks and ridges. I kept moving, boots slipping on wet roots, muscles trembling with exhaustion. I dared a glance over my shoulder. Nothing. Yet the sensation persisted, gnawing at the edges of reason. I reached a point where the trail descended, and the ridge began to open into more familiar territory. Relief should have come, but it didn't. The sense of being followed, of being watched, remained like a shadow clinging to my shoulders. By the time I reached the end of the ridge and the forest opened onto a wider trail, the rain had mostly stopped, but the dread had not lifted. Every step forward was haunted by the memory of those shadows and the soft, deliberate crunching of boots behind me. Even now, weeks later, I can close my eyes and feel the ridge pressing in, the fog curling around the hemlocks, the sensation of something keeping pace, just out of sight. I tell myself it was my imagination, that exhaustion and rain played cruel tricks. But my instincts say otherwise. Something was there, something watched me, and I know that if I ever walk that ridge alone again, it will be waiting. I had been trying to shave a few miles off my hike, following what I thought was a faint game trail through a hollow I'd never noticed before. The rain had slowed to a steady drizzle, but the forest floor was still slick with mud and fallen leaves, each step sucking at my boots. I wasn't sure why I chose this path. Something about it felt wrong the moment I stepped off the main trail. The hollow was narrower than I expected, the trees leaning in as if to whisper warnings I couldn't hear. A faint glow drew my attention, a lantern hanging from a gnarled tree, swinging slightly in the wind. It pulsed almost imperceptibly, and I thought at first it was the reflection of water droplets, the trick of a tired eye. But there it was again, steady and soft, like a heartbeat in the mist. I paused, hesitant, watching the lantern sway. No one appeared to hold it. My stomach tightened, a knot of unease settling deep in my gut. But something, curiosity, foolishness, whatever pride I held, rooted me in place. The air around the hollow felt thicker, damp and charged, and the rain made a hissing sound as it ran off slick branches above me. Shadows twisted inside the lantern's frame, dark and restless, shifting in ways that didn't match the rhythm of the swing. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, but the shapes remained, writhing subtly, as if alive. I wanted to turn back, to walk away and call it a trick of the weather, a reflection, anything rational, but my legs refused. The closer I approached, the more I felt the hollow itself breathing around me. The mist hung low to the ground, curling around my boots, and each step seemed muffled by the wet earth. The lantern's light pulsed in tandem with my heartbeat, or perhaps it was my imagination. I could feel something watching from the darkness just beyond the trees, the way the hollow seemed to lean in, anticipating me. I whispered to myself, trying to reassure myself that it was just the forest, just shadows and fog. But then I heard it, a whisper, soft and urgent. "You shouldn't be here." The words were clear, spoken close enough that my ear felt almost burned by them, yet I saw no one. My pulse surged, adrenaline flooding through me, but fear anchored me to the path. I considered running, turning my back on the hollow and its glow, but something compelled me forward. The shadows in the lantern swirled more rapidly as I drew nearer, dark shapes curling and uncurling like smoke trapped in glass. My flashlight trembled in my hands as I swept it across the tree trunks, trying to pierce the fog and see the edges of this strange clearing, but nothing emerged. Only the lantern and the oppressive sense that I had stumbled into a place the forest did not intend to be found. Each step I took seemed to echo, not in sound but in a pressure against my chest. The rain hissed along the branches, and the hollow's floor was slick, every fallen leaf threatening to betray my presence. I could feel the air shifting as I approached, subtle movements, a faint rustle just beyond the edges of my vision. I told myself to calm down, to breathe, to remember that the forest was just a forest, and I was alone. But the whisper came again, a little louder this time, urgent and coaxing, and the lantern seemed to pulse brighter, as though aware of my hesitation. Something in the way the light moved made me stumble backward. Shadows shifted inside it, forming shapes I couldn't identify, twisting figures that seemed to watch me as much as I watched them. The forest around me felt different now, older, more deliberate, like a living thing waiting to judge me for entering its private space. I tried to step away, but my boots sank into the wet mud, making every movement slow and labored. Each step away felt like pulling myself from quicksand, and every glance back revealed the lantern still glowing, still pulsing, still holding those dark, twisting shapes inside. I thought about shouting, trying to chase away whatever it was, but my voice caught in my throat. The forest was too quiet for words to matter. Even the rain had softened to a whisper of droplets, like it had been waiting for me to arrive. I could feel eyes, not human eyes, but something patient, something that had been observing me long before I noticed the hollow. And I knew with a certainty that made my stomach lurch that if I ran, it would follow. Not like a person pursuing, but like the forest itself, an awareness, an expectation, a force moving just beyond perception. The lantern seemed to drift slightly in the mist, though no wind touched it. I blinked, and the shadows inside it appeared to stretch toward me. I wanted to tear my eyes away, to force myself down the hollow, away from the gnarled tree and its unnatural glow, but curiosity, or foolishness, kept me rooted. I heard the whisper a third time, this one drawn out and closer, almost behind my shoulder, yet again when I turned, there was nothing. The shapes in the lantern seemed to lean outward, pressing against the glass, and I thought I saw faces inside the shadows, pale, distorted, and impossible to place. Panic finally broke through hesitation. My feet moved on their own, splashing through puddles and mud, the forest closing in on me with every step. But the hollow seemed to stretch endlessly, the path ahead always curving just enough to deny escape. The lantern remained behind me, visible at first, then flickering, then disappearing entirely into the fog, though I could feel its presence, an oppressive weight pressing into the hollow like a living thing. The whispering followed me, carried in the wet air, teasing, coaxing, mocking me, though no voice could be traced. I tripped over a root, sprawling in the mud, and scrambled to my feet, chest heaving, hands trembling. I looked back again, expecting nothing, yet the hollow itself seemed to pulse with light in my mind's eye, shadows writhing in places the eye could not see. My senses screamed that the place was alive, watching, breathing. My flashlight shook in my grip as I tried to find the path out. I could feel the mist curling around my boots like fingers, tugging at my ankles, urging me forward and backward at once. Hours or minutes passed in a haze of wet leaves and shifting shadows. I stumbled onto the main trail eventually, soaked to the bone, lungs burning from exertion and fear, boots caked in mud. The hollow behind me seemed to sigh, receding into the mist, yet the oppressive feeling remained. My hands shook as I tried to steady my breathing, and the memory of the lantern's glow and its twisting shadows lingered like a mark on my mind. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can see it pulsing in the fog, hear the whisper carried on wet wind. You shouldn't be here. I never went back to that hollow. I avoided entirely, taking the long route along the trail even in heavy rain, and sometimes late at night, when the house is silent and the rain hammers against the roof. I swear I can hear the hollow breathing again. The whisper echoes faintly, and the image of that lantern, twisted shadows inside, pulses behind my eyelids. I have no explanation for it, none I could offer that would make sense. But I know what I felt, I know what I saw, and I know that some places in these mountains are patient, waiting for the unwary, and that curiosity is never innocent when the forest is watching. Rain hammered the trail as I climbed, soaking through my jacket and making every step treacherous. The mud was thick and slippery, sticking to my boots and sucking at each movement as though the earth itself were resisting me. Loose stones shifted beneath my weight, sending sharp jolts up my legs. I had started the hike earlier that morning with the usual excitement, eager for the solitude and the chance to push myself along a rarely used ridge. But the deeper I climbed, the more the forest seemed to close in around me, heavy with rain and mist. Every branch and leaf pressing down in a way that made my chest tighten. Somewhere along the second mile, I began to notice the echoes. At first I thought it was the way my own voice carried along the wet, hollowed-out trail. I called out, joking to myself, "Anybody up there?" And my voice returned, faint and warped, carried back through the trees. But then it happened again, this time not in response to anything I said. A whisper, low and deliberate, but with the unmistakable cadence of my own speech. I froze mid-step, scanning the slick trail, but the forest around me remained quiet, rain the only sound in the hollow. My heart jumped, adrenaline pumping as my mind tried to rationalize it. Wind through the trees, water dripping off rocks. But a cold certainty settled in my gut that this was something else. I pressed forward cautiously, gripping my trekking poles tighter, boots slipping on mud and leaves. The path wound along ridges and narrow switchbacks, and every bend seemed to reveal the same shadow, a fleeting figure just beyond my focus, disappearing whenever I tried to see it clearly. My pulse throbbed in my ears as I forced myself to keep moving, but the shadows followed in the periphery of my vision, moving in ways that made no sense. A tree would shake as though someone passed by. A fallen branch would snap beneath invisible weight. Yet whenever I spun, the trail would be empty. Then came the echoes again. My own voice, speaking words I hadn't said, phrases that seemed ripped from my thoughts. "Slow down. You're not alone. Why did you come here?" Each repetition was sharper, closer, and for the first time I felt that sickening animal fear of being observed, hunted not by eyes, but by something patient and deliberate. I tried to call out, to confront it, but the sound that emerged was distorted, almost my own, repeating back at me before I could even finish a sentence. The forest was mimicking me, reflecting me in some way I could not understand. The rain continued, relentless, soaking me to the bone. I tried to focus on the trail, counting steps, using the wet stones and roots as markers to ground myself. But the further I climbed, the more the forest seemed to stretch unnaturally, the trees leaning closer, forming narrow corridors that kept me locked inside. Every bend brought another glimpse of that shifting shadow, and every echo twisted my words in ways that made my chest tighten with dread. My flashlight flickered, though I hadn't needed it yet, and I could swear the shadows inside the beam moved independently, lingering where no one could be. My exhaustion made my mind fragile. I stumbled several times, mud sucking my boots, hands scraping against wet roots. Each time I rose, I felt it closer, something pacing me, patient, almost intelligent in its movements. The echoes grew louder, more complex, forming full sentences I hadn't spoken, taunting me, guiding me, warning me. "You can't leave," one said as my breath came fast and ragged. Another, "We know your name." I didn't dare look back directly. Each time I risked it, I felt the weight of unseen eyes on my back. By the time I reached the final mile to the summit, the trail had narrowed to a slick spine of rock and mud. The rain pounded harder, blurring everything around me, and the fog had thickened, curling like fingers along the ridge. I realized the echoes had multiplied, layering over one another, my own voice interspersed with words I could not place. Every step forward was accompanied by sounds I could only describe as mimicking me. The rhythm of my breathing, the slap of my boots, the mutterings of my own thoughts. I felt completely surrounded, utterly alone yet impossibly observed. the forest alive with some patient intelligence that was teasing me, learning from me. The summit finally came into view, a small rocky clearing, but even there, the dread did not lift. The echoes were strongest here, bouncing from boulder to boulder, carrying the rain with them, turning my own speech into a chorus of unfamiliar commands and observations. I could see the valley spread out below, lights dim in the far distance, but I could not let my gaze linger. The forest pressed in at the edges, fog curling along the ridge like smoke. I thought about sitting, catching my breath, but my instinct screamed no. The shadows lingered just out of focus, and I knew that the forest, or whatever was in it, had followed me here. I stayed there, frozen for what felt like hours, until the echoes faded enough for me to gather the courage to descend. Every step down was deliberate, cautious, boots slipping in mud, eyes darting to every movement along the ridge. The voices had calmed but had not disappeared, lingering in my memory like a stain, shaping my perception of the path. Even now, thinking back, I can hear them faintly in the silence of my apartment, the repetition of my own words, distorted and alien, and the feeling of being studied, of something learning from me while I slept. The summit behind me. I finally emerged onto a wider, more familiar trail. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, the forest opening into a less oppressive canopy. Relief should have washed over me, but it did not. The echoes, though quieter, still followed in my mind, and the ridge, the trail, the shadows, they had left a mark. Even weeks later, I cannot pass a wooded slope or hear the wind in the pines without sensing eyes watching, without hearing the faint, distorted whispers of words I never spoke, as though the forest itself had learned to speak through me. I tell people about it sometimes, but few believe me. They expect a story of misjudgment, of exhaustion, of imagination running wild in isolation. But I know what I heard. I know the shadows were there. I know the forest copied my voice, mirrored my movements, and waited patiently as I struggled along its wet, endless trail. Some nights, when the wind rattles the windows, I swear I hear it again, the echoes of my own words, twisted and carried back from some unseen place in the hills, reminding me that I was never alone, and that whatever followed me that night may still be learning. The rain had been relentless all afternoon, and by the time I wandered off the trail, I was soaked to the bone. My boots squelched in the mud, and the forest around me was a gray, dripping haze. That's when I saw it, a small cabin tucked into a hollow, its walls darkened with age and water stains, almost swallowed by the overgrowth of moss and fallen branches. I hadn't noticed it before. Perhaps the rain or my exhaustion had kept me from seeing the narrow path leading to it. I hesitated for a moment, shivering, debating whether I should turn back. But the promise of shelter, even from something as uncertain as this, was too tempting. The cabin door hung crooked on its hinges. When I pushed it open, a long creak echoed into the hollow, and a wave of wet rot hit me, pungent and clinging. The smell of mold and decay made my stomach turn, but I pressed inside anyway. The floorboards groaned beneath my weight, and the dim light of the gray afternoon struggled to reach the corners. At first glance, the cabin seemed empty, abandoned for years. Dust coated the surfaces and broken furniture lay scattered. But then I noticed something that froze me in place. A pair of boots, lined up neatly by the hearth, water dripping from their worn leather. No one was there. I froze, heart hammering. The boots had to belong to someone, but the room was silent and still, save for the dripping of water from the ceiling. I stepped closer, the floorboards protesting with sharp creaks. The boots were ordinary enough, scuffed and well-used, but their placement suggested someone had carefully set them there. My rational mind argued that maybe someone had abandoned the cabin recently. Maybe a hiker or camper had left them for some reason, but the forest was quiet, and the trail to the cabin seemed overgrown and rarely used. I set my backpack down near the corner and tried to make a small area to rest. Sleep was necessary, but the unease coiled in my chest like a living thing. As night fell, the hollow outside darkened, rain tapping steadily on the roof, soft at first, then heavier, hammering like distant drumming. I tried to settle, curling into the corner, but the cabin refused to be still. Footsteps began above me, light but deliberate, pacing across the upper floor. I strained my ears, heart thrumming in my chest. The wood creaked in rhythms that were unnervingly human, and yet when I dared to call out, no reply came. My voice seemed swallowed by the walls, bouncing back only in a muffled echo that did nothing to reassure me. I clutched my knees, trying to convince myself it was the old cabin settling. But the sound of pacing, calculated and deliberate, continued hour after hour. Every groan of the floorboards, every drip from the ceiling seemed amplified in the dark. I caught glimpses of shadowy shapes from the corner of my eyes, flickering just at the edges of the weak light filtering through the cabin's windows. My mind raced, balancing between rational explanations and the creeping sense that I was not alone. The boots by the hearth seemed to gleam faintly in the dark, though the rain had stopped dripping from them hours ago. I wanted to cover them, move them out of sight, but I couldn't bring myself to touch them. Time slowed, stretched into long minutes of tense silence punctuated by the soft, relentless pacing overhead. My own breathing felt loud in the cabin, and every movement I made, shifting my weight, scratching at my damp clothes, reaching for my flashlight, was mirrored by creaks above. I tried to rationalize, telling myself that perhaps a raccoon or other forest animal had found its way upstairs, but the steps were far too measured, too human. The cabin was empty, or so I told myself. But the evidence around me, the boots, the pacing, argued otherwise. I huddled deeper into the corner, eyes fixed on the hearth, willing the hours to pass. The rain outside slowed, leaving a soft drizzle that pattered on the roof, but inside the cabin remained alive with sound and presence. I considered leaving, storming out into the mud and rain, but fear rooted me in place. The forest outside was dark and unfamiliar, each step potentially taking me further into isolation than safety. I remained, listening, sweating from both cold and fear, aware that my own heartbeat was loud enough to echo in the small space. Morning eventually came, though it felt like a cruel deception. Light seeped weakly through the cracks in the walls, revealing the damp decay in sharp detail. I dared to breathe, slow and cautious, scanning the cabin. The boots, carefully placed just hours before, were gone. No sign of disturbance in the floorboards, no note, no figure retreating into shadow. The pacing had stopped, replaced only by the soft drip of water from the roof and the distant call of birds waking to a soggy day. Relief should have come, but it didn't. The unease lingered, a residue in the air in my chest, as though the cabin itself had watched me, entertained itself and then receded, leaving only memory. I packed my things quickly, boots squelching, heart still thrumming, and left the cabin behind. The forest outside was damp, slick, and quiet, almost too quiet, but I kept my gaze forward, refusing to glance back at the hollow or its strange, vanished inhabitant. The trail back was muddy and treacherous, each step reminding me of the precariousness of solitude in this wet, living forest. Even as I reached the main path, even as daylight grew stronger and familiar landmarks emerged, the sense of being watched lingered. Weeks later, I still think about that cabin. I replay the images of the boots, the shadows shifting just beyond perception, the pacing above me. I wonder what or who had occupied that space, or whether it had been occupied at all. Rationally, I tell myself it was an old cabin, abandoned and prone to settling noises, perhaps even a visitor who had left before I arrived. But the fear, the certainty that I had been observed, that the cabin had a patience far beyond my own, cannot be dismissed. The memory lingers, a quiet weight in my mind, a reminder that some places in the mountains hold more than we can understand, and that curiosity can sometimes carry consequences that are unseen, unmeasured, and lingering. Even now I dream of it, the darkened walls, the boots by the hearth, the deliberate pacing above, and the oppressive silence that followed once I fled. I know I was alone, or at least I should have been, but the hollow keeps its secrets, and I left knowing some truths are never meant to be uncovered. The memory of that night remains wet, heavy, and impossible to shake. A quiet echo of dread that I carry long after the forest has receded from sight. The trail had been familiar at first, winding along the ridge and lined with wet pines that dripped constantly from the earlier rain. But somewhere past the second mile, the fog arrived. It wasn't the usual light mist that curls lazily among the trees. It was heavy, thick, and damp, pressing against me from all sides like an invisible wall. Every step forward felt like wading through water, not because of the ground itself, but because the air resisted me, muffling sounds and dampening the faintest light from the gray sky above. My boots sank into the wet soil and moss, and the forest seemed to stretch endlessly, folding back on itself in ways that made my mind strain to reconcile what was ahead and behind. At first, I thought it was simply dense fog, a natural consequence of elevation and rain. But as I pressed forward, I noticed something odd. The trees began to look less like trees and more like shapes, tall and lean, their branches twisting unnaturally. Sometimes, in a corner of my vision, a shape seemed to shift just beyond focus, a dark figure lingering briefly before vanishing. I called out a soft hello into the wet stillness, but the only reply was the muted splash of my own boots and the hiss of dripping water. My voice seemed to die in the fog, swallowed entirely, and the sense of being watched settled deep into my chest. I tried to follow my map, but it became useless. Every turn led me back to the same eerie spot, a cluster of bent pines, roots breaking the ground in the same pattern, moss-covered rocks forming the same arrangement over and over. My sense of direction failed me completely. Minutes and hours bled together. The forest seemed endless, the fog making it impossible to gauge distance or time. My heart thumped, each beat sounding impossibly loud in my own ears, and the thought that I was utterly lost began to gnaw at me. Then I saw it, a figure standing just beyond a bend, tall, thin, and impossible to make out in the swirling fog. I froze, hand gripping my trekking pole like a lifeline. "Hey!" I called, my voice cracking, but the figure did not respond. When I took a cautious step forward, it was gone, evaporated into the mist as if it had never existed. A shiver ran through me, and I began to move faster, boots squelching in mud, heart hammering. The fog thickened, curling around me like fingers, and each tree I passed seemed to lean closer, branches scratching at my jacket, pressing me inward toward the center of the hollow. Hours passed, or maybe only minutes. Time was meaningless. The fog swallowed everything, the trail, my bearings, even the faint sense of light from the overcast sky. I kept moving, telling myself I would eventually emerge, but every step returned me to that same cluster of twisted pines. Faces appeared in the fog, fleeting and distorted, shadows bending into the semblance of eyes and mouths. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and they were gone, but the unease remained, gnawing at my mind. I began to hear whispers. Soft, almost imperceptible at first, rising with the fog itself. Sometimes they sounded like words I knew, sometimes like phrases pulled from memory, distorted, impossible to interpret fully. I thought I glimpsed movement between the trees, another figure crouched or standing, but whenever I looked directly, nothing remained. My pulse raced and a sense of vertigo took hold. The forest was watching, patient and silent, letting the fog swallow me completely, shaping the space around me, twisting the trail into a maze I could not escape. I stumbled over roots and rocks, scraped my hands along the damp bark of pines, and called out again, hoping for an answer, for another human presence, anything. But the fog answered only with silence, thick and suffocating. Each step forward felt heavier, the air resisting, my lungs burning. I tried to leave the trail entirely, forcing myself toward what I thought was a lower slope, but the fog was cunning. Every direction looked the same. Every turn brought me back to the same twisted cluster of trees, the same moss-covered boulders, the same unrelenting emptiness. The day faded slowly, though I could not tell. The forest had become a void, gray and wet, pressing against my senses. Shapes lingered in my vision, shifting subtly, as if keeping pace with me. My breathing grew ragged, fear clawing through exhaustion, and I realized that I was not alone. Something or someone was moving in the fog with me, always just beyond reach, a presence that watched but never revealed itself. I wanted to scream, to run blindly, but the mud and roots stole my footing with every step. I had no choice but to move carefully, one cautious step after another, heart hammering like a drum in the hollow. At some point, the forest seemed to stretch in ways that made no sense. The same boulder I passed turned into another boulder, then another, forming a looping corridor of shapes and shadows. The fog thickened further, curling around my boots and ankles like living smoke, pressing against my chest. Faces appeared again, fleeting and distorted, but when I tried to focus, they melted into shadow. I realized then that the forest itself had become alive with intention, shaping the fog and the trail to confuse me, to draw me deeper into its silence. I stumbled into a small clearing at one point, thinking perhaps I would finally find a landmark. But it was identical to the previous clearings, trees leaning inward, mist curling over the ground in that same impossible stillness. And then I heard my name, a soft, almost intimate whisper carried through the fog, my own voice, yet distorted, unfamiliar. My knees buckled and I pressed my hands to my face, trying to block it out, but the sound persisted, following me with the fog. My own voice had become a tool, mimicked by whatever watched me, used to unnerve and confuse. Panic took hold and I ran blindly. Branches lashing at my arms and face, mud sucking at my boots, every instinct screaming that I had to escape. Hours, or perhaps a lifetime later, I stumbled onto a faint animal trail that eventually led me back to the main path. The fog thinned slightly, and the forest opened into familiar shapes. Relief should have come, but it did not. The memory of the forest's patience, of the fog curling like smoke and twisting the trail into a labyrinth, lingered. The shadows, the faces, the whispered mimicry of my own voice remained in my mind like a stain. Even now, I cannot pass a dense patch of pines or see fog curling across a trail without feeling that same oppressive weight, that same certainty of being observed by something patient, silent, and intelligent. I tell myself it was exhaustion, or disorientation, or a trick of weather. But the memory is too vivid, too deliberate. The faces in the fog, the shadowed figure, the way the forest reshaped itself around me. It wasn't imagination. Some parts of these mountains are patient, and the fog is their tool. They wait for those who wander alone, who step off familiar paths. And when curiosity leads the way, the forest watches, quietly shaping the trail, echoing voices, and letting the fog swallow you whole, even weeks later. I dream of that place, the thick gray mist curling like smoke, the twisting shadows, the distorted faces and trees, the trail that never truly ends. And I wake with the same feeling that the forest is still watching, still patient, and still waiting for those who wander too far, trusting in their own sense of direction and their fragile rationality. I never take that ridge again, and I never underestimate fog. The storm hit with little warning, turning the forest into a relentless wall of wind and rain. I had been following a narrow game trail along a ridge when the sky darkened and the clouds broke, pouring down cold, relentless sheets of water. The path disappeared beneath slick mud, leaves clinging to my boots and pulling me down with every step. I was soaked through in minutes, teeth chattering and desperate for shelter when I stumbled upon a rock overhang, jutting from the hillside. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. A slanted, natural canopy that offered some protection from the driving rain. I settled beneath it, trying to make myself small and out of the wind, sitting on the damp earth and listening to the storm pound against the forest. The wind whistled between the trees, carrying the smell of wet pine and earth, and for a long moment, I thought I could relax, could convince myself I was safe. But then I heard it, a soft scratching, faint at first, a subtle rhythm against the stone above me. My breath caught in my throat and I froze, listening. I told myself it was a branch scraping against the rock, or maybe a small animal trying to take shelter. The forest is full of noises, I reminded myself. But the scratching persisted, growing gradually louder, deliberate, as if something was circling just beyond the edge of my sight. I held still, straining to hear over the storm. Each scratch, each subtle shift of stone against something clawed my nerves raw. My hands gripped my knees, cold and slick with rainwater, and I tried to plan an escape. The path I had followed was gone, washed away by runoff and mudslides, leaving nothing but slick soil and the suggestion of the ridge beneath me. Every instinct screamed that moving might be dangerous, that the forest had transformed into something patient and observing, waiting for me to make a mistake. The scratching grew closer, accompanied now by a low, wet sound, like claws dragging across stone. My stomach churned and a tight knot formed in my chest. I dared to inch my head out from beneath the overhang, scanning the shadows beyond. But the storm and fog made visibility almost nil. The forest looked different, distorted by rain and wind, the trees leaning inward as though to watch me. Every rock, every moss-covered root seemed to hold a secret, a hidden presence. The thought that I was being circled, studied, made my skin crawl. I tried to leave. Slowly, carefully, I crawled from beneath the overhang, boots slipping in mud, hands scraping against wet roots. The moment I stepped beyond the shelter, the scratching stopped. I froze, heart pounding. The silence was worse than the sound, a patient, expectant quiet that pressed against my ears and chest. It felt like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for me to move again. When I shifted, the noise returned, closer, sharper, deliberate, as though the creature, or presence, had adjusted its position to keep pace. I stumbled through mud and rain, trying to retrace the path I thought I'd taken, but the storm had erased everything. The trail was gone, replaced by a chaotic maze of slick slopes and tangled roots. I shouted into the forest, but my voice was swallowed instantly, lost to the wind and downpour. Each step felt heavier, every root and stone a hazard, every shadow in the rain-streaked fog a possible threat. The sense of being hunted, circled, watched, never left me. Hours passed, or perhaps only minutes, but the forest remained unyielding. The rain hammered down, my clothing clinging to my skin, body chilled to the bone. I slipped repeatedly, hands scraped raw, boots caked in mud, and still the scratching persisted, circling, adapting to my movements. Sometimes I thought I saw shapes in the shadows, glimpses of something moving too quickly for a human, too deliberate for an animal. Each time I turned, the forest was empty, yet the sound continued, patient, almost mocking. At one point, I found a shallow depression in the slope, water pooling around it. I tried to use it as a resting point, crouching low, hoping exhaustion might give me a moment's clarity. The storm blurred all edges, and I realized the rock overhang was no longer behind me, only a continuation of slick cliffs and leaning pines. My mind raced. What circled me? Was it an animal, a person? Something older, something patient and calculating? I could not know. I could only keep moving, guided by instinct and terror, aware that staying still invited whatever presence had been circling me to investigate. The scratching intensified suddenly, accompanied by a wet, dragging sound that I cannot describe rationally. I ran blindly, boots slipping, hands clawing at roots, slipping into mud. The forest twisted around me, fog thickening with every step, the storm relentless, and yet I could not escape the sensation of being pursued. Every tree, every rock, every shadow seemed complicit in some quiet watchfulness. My body screamed for rest, but fear drove me onward. Dusk approached, or it felt like it, but the storm showed no mercy. I found myself climbing a steep slope, mud sucking at my boots, wind lashing at my face. The overhang, or where it had been, was nowhere in sight. The forest seemed endless, folding back on itself. Each step brought the faint wet scraping closer, now audible over the wind and rain, circling with patience, never directly confronting, but making its presence unmistakable. I stumbled again and fell, sliding down a slick patch of mud, coming to rest in a small hollow. My breathing was ragged, lungs burning, soaked to the bone. The scraping stopped, leaving only the storm and silence, but I could feel it, an awareness lingering, the same patient observation from hours earlier. I did not dare move for long minutes, waiting for any signal, any sign that I could safely continue. When I finally stood, limbs trembling, I took careful, measured steps, boots sinking into mud, eyes scanning the distorted forest. Hours, or an indeterminate stretch of time later, I found the ridge again, the storm finally easing into a drizzle. The forest opened slightly, allowing dim light to filter through the soaked canopy. Relief should have been immediate, but it wasn't. The memory of circling scratches, the patient, unseen presence, lingered. I knew that however far I moved from that rock overhang, the forest would keep its secret, watching, patient, waiting for the next wanderer foolish enough to seek shelter beneath its ancient stones. Even now, thinking back, I can feel the chill of that night, the relentless rain, the wet, dripping overhang, the dragging claws of sound, the patient circling. I cannot explain what was there. Rationally, it might have been an animal, a displaced hiker, something else entirely. But the certainty I felt then was undeniable. The forest itself had seemed alive, aware, shaping my movements, teaching me fear. The overhang remains in my memory, a darkened, dripping slice of wilderness, a place I will never return to, and a reminder that some corners of these mountains are patient, silent, and infinitely watchful. The trail leading to the bridge had been muddy and slick from days of rain, each step sinking my boots deeper into the wet earth. I had been hiking alone, carrying only the basics, hoping for a few quiet hours of solitude along the creek that carved its way through the ridge. By the time I reached the old wooden bridge, the sky was a flat gray, the canopy above dripping steady rivulets onto my shoulders and backpack. The bridge looked ancient, boards warped and weathered, rusted nails jutting at odd angles, yet it had survived decades of floods and storms. I paused for a moment, trying to peer down at the swollen creek below, dark water roiling and churning among the rocks. The first step onto the bridge made it groan sharply beneath me. I brushed it off as age and rot, yet the sway of the boards felt strange, almost deliberate. I glanced around. There was no wind. The trees on either side stood unmoving, the forest silent save for the rush of the creek. I took another step, and the bridge shifted again, subtle but undeniable, as though testing me, sensing my weight, my hesitation. A chill ran down my spine, and I muttered under my breath that it was just old wood, that these mountains hold countless bridges older than memory. Then came the sound, a low, wet laughter echoing from beneath the bridge. I froze, heart hammering in my chest, scanning the creek below. The banks were empty, the water tossing itself against rocks, and yet the laughter persisted, a wet, gurgling sound that seemed to come from the hollow space between the boards. It was human in cadence, but wrong somehow, too hollow, too full of amusement that was not mine to share. I held my breath, stepping carefully, trying to tell myself it was my imagination, the creek playing tricks on my mind. But then the laughter came again, louder, surrounding me, bouncing off the trees, the water, the underside of the bridge itself. My instincts screamed to run, but I was rooted to the boards. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing in the hollow space beneath me, threading itself into my ears, settling in my chest. The boards groaned beneath my shifting weight, as though they too were alive, warning or testing me. I whispered to myself that there was no one here, that I was alone. Yet the sound persisted, wet and patient, like some being enjoying the sight of its prey. I turned to retreat, but the bridge seemed longer now, stretched in some subtle, impossible way. Each step back brought the same groan, the same laughter, following me, reverberating, overlapping. My boots slipped on wet boards, mud staining my hands as I grabbed the rail for balance. I stumbled, and the laughter twisted, rising and falling with my panic. It was close enough now that I could feel it in my ribs, a vibration that matched my own heart, mocking and relentless. When I finally reached the far end of the bridge, I did not dare look back. My chest heaved as I bolted into the mud and forest beyond, boots skidding, branches whipping against my arms. But even as I ran, the laughter followed, fading only slightly with distance. I dared not pause, even as my lungs burned, my vision blurred by rain and sweat, my ears straining for some other sound. Every so often, a branch would snap, or a stone would shift underfoot, but always in rhythm with the echo of that laughter, teaching me that it was patient, guiding me, keeping pace with me in a way that no human could. Hours, or what felt like hours later, I stumbled onto a broader, more traveled trail. The forest opened slightly, the creek distant now, the bridge behind me out of sight. Relief should have come, but it didn't. The memory of the groaning boards, the low, wet laughter, the hollow echo beneath my feet lingered. I knew, without understanding why, that it had followed me, that the bridge itself had been a conduit for something patient and unseen. Even now, thinking back, I can hear it faintly in quiet moments. The hollow laughter, resonating from someplace in the mountains, a reminder that solitude in these forests can carry consequences, and that the things that linger beneath old, forgotten bridges may not be entirely natural. The mountains are patient. They remember the paths of those who wander too far, those who step onto bridges long abandoned, who listen too closely to the rush of water beneath them. I tell myself it was imagination, stress, the isolation of the trail, yet the certainty remains. The boards groan in my mind, the laughter echoes faintly in the spaces between my thoughts, and the memory of that bridge, the hollow bridge, remains as vivid as the day I crossed it. Even now, when I pass a creek or hear water rushing over rocks, I pause just slightly, feeling the weight of the unseen. I do not take bridges lightly anymore. Some places, I have learned, are not simply crossings. They are thresholds, patient and watchful, carrying the memory of those who dared tread their boards, echoing the terror and fascination of their passing into the quiet hollows of the forest. And the hollow bridge waits still in the mountains, swollen waters rushing beneath it, patient, silent, and ready to remind the next wanderer of what follows when you cross into its shadows alone. The rain came down in sheets, relentless and cold, turning the trail into a slick ribbon of mud and slick stone. I had been hiking the ridge all afternoon, knowing the ascent would be tough, but not anticipating the storm that had rolled in so suddenly. The wind whipped through the trees, bending the hemlocks and rattling branches overhead, drumming a constant, chaotic rhythm on my rain-soaked jacket. My flashlight cut through the gray curtain of rain in narrow beams, illuminating only the nearest roots and rocks, everything else swallowed by darkness. I kept my head down, focusing on each step, boots sliding in the mud, heart hammering in my chest, telling myself I would reach the summit soon. At first, the sounds of the storm were the only company. Rain splattering on leaves, branches snapping under their own weight, the distant groan of trees swaying in the wind. But then, faint at first, almost imperceptible, came voices. I froze mid-step, straining to hear. They were soft, murmurs carried on the wind, almost overlapping with the rush of rain, but distinct enough to make my skin crawl. I couldn't understand the words, but they sounded familiar, like a language I had once heard spoken, perhaps in a documentary or a story. They were close, yet not close, always just beyond the reach of my senses. I called out, my voice swallowed immediately by the wind and water. The murmuring did not respond, only shifted, like it was aware of my presence and adjusting, keeping pace. My pace quickened, boots slipping in the mud, flashlight trembling in my hand. The trail had disappeared under the storm. Every step I thought would lead me upward only led to slick rocks or tangled roots. The voices seemed to follow, circling me in the rain, impossible to locate but undeniably there. The thought that I was not alone settled heavily in my chest, an icy weight that made each breath a struggle. The forest itself seemed altered, distorted by the storm. Trees loomed taller, closer together, and the wind carried a strange timbre, bending the voices around branches and trunks so that I could hear them from multiple directions at once. I stumbled over a root, hands scraping against bark, and the murmuring shifted slightly higher in pitch, almost like laughter, but a low, restrained kind, as though testing me, observing me. My heart raced, mind spinning, but I pressed onward, determined to reach the ridge. Each step became a battle between logic and instinct, between the drive to survive and the terror that I was being stalked by something I could not name. Hours, or maybe only minutes, passed in the storm's unyielding rhythm. My flashlight flickered, threatening to die, and I realized how isolated I truly was. The ridge was near, I could feel it, but the voices continued their eerie accompaniment, rising and falling with the rhythm of my steps. Sometimes I thought I glimpsed movement in the foggy shadows, fleeting shapes that mirrored my pace, vanishing whenever I focused directly on them. My rational mind argued that the wind and storm were playing tricks, that I was imagining it all, but the certainty in the presence of something alongside me was undeniable. I tried calling out again, sharper this time, demanding attention, but the storm swallowed my words. The murmuring shifted, moving closer, yet still out of reach, weaving between the trees and rocks in a way that was deliberate, almost intimate. My lungs burned with exertion, every muscle screaming, but the fear that had settled into my chest would not let me stop. Every time I thought I could spot the source of the voices, the sound moved, never allowing me to face it. I felt like a child being chased by shadows, except these shadows had patience, knowledge, and intent. The final pitch of the ascent was the worst. The wind clawed at my jacket, rain driving into my face, and the mud threatened to pull me back with every step. I kept my head low, flashlight angled downward, scanning each foothold. And then I heard it again, a murmur of voices directly to my right, just behind me now. I dared to glance sideways. Nothing. Only the twisted, wet shapes of trees and rocks. Panic took hold, and I broke into a stumble run, boots sliding through mud, hands scraping for balance. The voices followed, close now, rising above the storm in tone and intensity, weaving in a rhythm that matched my own pulse. Finally, I reached the summit, or what I assumed was the summit. Exhausted, drenched, my muscles trembling, I collapsed onto a rock, gasping, hands shaking as I tried to comprehend what had just happened. The storm had eased slightly, the rain thinning to a drizzle, and yet the murmuring persisted, faint now but undeniably present, echoing across the ridge as though the forest itself had carried it there. I looked around, sweeping my flashlight across the wet rocks and hemlocks, but no one was there. Nothing moved, and yet the certainty remained. I had not been alone. Something had been climbing with me the entire time, patient and silent, guiding itself alongside me, hidden in the storm and shadows. I sat for long moments, catching my breath, shivering from cold and fear, trying to convince myself it had been my imagination, some heightened sense brought on by exhaustion and rain. But I could not shake the feeling that the forest had been alive in a way I did not understand, that the voices had been deliberately keeping pace, observing, testing me. The isolation of the ridge, the storm, the fog, and the voices had combined into an experience that I could neither rationalize nor ignore. Eventually, I descended cautiously, moving with slow, deliberate steps, flashlight sweeping constantly. Every shadow seemed to twitch at the edge of perception, every tree a possible observer. Even as I neared more familiar trails, the memory of the voices, of the deliberate companionship in the storm, remained etched into my mind. My pace slowed only when I reached shelter below the ridge, and even then the unease lingered, a weight pressing on my chest that did not fade with warmth or dry clothing. Weeks later, I still feel it when storms roll over the mountains. When wind and rain lash the trees and creek beds, I hear the faintest murmur, almost a memory of the voices, and my skin crawls. I do not know if it was a person, a group, or something older and stranger, but the certainty of that presence is indelible. The ridge had been patient, and the storm had been its ally. I learned that solitude in these mountains is fragile, that even when you think you are alone, the forest can hold company you cannot see, voices you cannot place, and watchers you cannot confront even now. When I think back on that final ascent, I can feel the rain driving into my face, hear the whispered voices weaving around me, and remember the certainty that I had never truly been alone. The forest keeps its secrets, patient and enduring, and some paths, especially in storms and fog, carry companions unseen, following with patience and intent, leaving their imprint long after the hiker has left.